Hello everyone, today we talk about medieval Piedmont and the development of the Racunician Commune. We are essentially in central southern Piedmont. This is a town in the Marquisate of Saluzzo, as we will see now, which is in turn a fief of seigneury of that is particularly pronounced regime style of government in this more sort of sheltered area in the westernmost part of the Po Valley in the pre-Alpinic areas that retains in fact a big deal of traditional features compared to the more sort of urbanly led Lombard communes indeed, and it's somehow strange how the cycle and or like the specials accidentally mix together. Just yesterday we were talking about the Swiss communes and how they started their journey in a good part, especially in the originary bulk, Uri, Schwyz and Unterwalden, from a rural background. The history of European communes is so important as underrated because from one side we've seen it, that there is a bit of a feudal bias in our understanding of the Middle Ages. We think that everything in medieval Europe was fundamentally just countryside, castles, and only knights, right, on horseback, right? But things were, of course, much more shaded, yet not even in an opposite sense, right? There was a lot of conflict, as we will see. But, say, the commune as such is something that basically every local community develops like, right? This is true from Italy to Scandinavia, from Spain to, we've seen it, the Ostsiedlung. And so we shall talk a bit more frequently about this because, the focus is mostly, as unavoidably, on the Italian communes that constitute this overwhelming dimension, like of European civilization, but other countries, in spite of a lesser urban development, and especially a lesser political development of their cities, rather towns, do have, also in these fringe areas of Italy itself, quite important autonomy that matches with the degree of power, indeed, that they were experiencing at the time, also in contrast to the nobility, which is a topic that not just is misunderstood, as we just said, most often as a sort of class or ideological struggle, but it's also sort of skipping entirely how these systems were organically framed within the same feudal hierarchy and developed because of the same nobiliar will to reinforce their grip on the local territory. There would be so much to say, but today we look at Racconigi for the simple fact it's one of the more defiled towns that you don't often hear of, if anything, just maybe because of the later contemporary Savoy history residences there, but that in fact had an important medieval past, one that we can document and articulate in the context of medieval Piedmont throughout different centuries, because they are also very long-lasting polities, entities, with a defined identity and sort of attitude, you can argue, that especially flourished during the peak of medieval civilizations. We look now from the 12th to the 14th century mostly. So again, Racconigi, central southern Piedmont. What happens at the end of the 12th century, a phase of tumultuous growth. We will look at Piedmontese history a bit more in depth. Like I made a video about Asti, we talked about that, both the commune and the bishopric. So we're not new to that. We made also a video about Savoy. We've seen how that seigneury, the feudal house expanded into Piedmont largely. So we hinted at Racconigi as well. But this is really like a relatively small reality in which, nevertheless, a community of homines established a commune at the end of the 12th century. this is fundamentally important. Like, so when we look at homines, these are conventionally, depending on the source, but especially in this context, freemen, right? So as we'll see now, they're not simple, even just simple freemen, right? Some of them are wealthy, and or they have full property, like even a property like a nobilium, recognized under their control, and they managed to expand in this period also outside of a specific dynastic direction, which is often the case for many different realities. Also, as we've seen, the bigger communes are at least developing a sort of republican regime run by the milites, right, by the military class. Here, there are spaces that can essentially develop and evolve pretty much on their own, right? This is a picture we also often skip. Like, people are somehow convinced that the Middle Ages were a pool of darkness where everybody was sort of a serf or whatever. This depends also on which parts of the world or Europe you're looking at. And that, however, in modern times, people got freer. This is completely wrong, right? You can't make it a case there whether people increase their quality of life, their overall wealth, but everybody knows, and this is so notorious for any person with a minimal academic education in medieval history, that like the entire social history of, say, medieval and modern Europe is the fact that at the end of the Middle Ages, the ancien regime affirms itself in that the peasantry loses practically any autonomy that it had actually enjoyed in a very potent way during the very Middle Ages. So again, the notion that modernity brought a greater relative freedom is completely false in every country, right? You don't find anything remotely going in the opposite direction at a macroscopical scale. Nevertheless, there are very deep reasons I can't digress on, because again, you have been told that everything changed from the 16th century, that, I don't know, the Reformation was a good thing, the science was invented during the Renaissance, that ever since everything went so beautifully and everything was great and everything that existed before was wrong and bad, whatever. These are things that even conservatives believe, especially in the Anglo-American world, that, sometimes they literally shock you because of the absolute cultural illiteracy in every elementary historical sense that you can find. But never mind that. Now, this is important because these homines definitely can expand within a traditional context. Here we're talking about a typical Romano-Germanic sense of freedom in the countryside. So the place that indeed was actually presenting less autonomy compared to the bigger centers, like in this case of the Po Valley. We've seen Asti being the larger one in Piedmont, being actually a minor one compared to the Lombard, to the Tuscan ones on average. And so Piedmont as a whole is a bit again, more feudal, more rural, less sort of interconnected, especially in this southwestern part, for which people are normally more prey of the local dynasty. But this is not the case, because it's not like these nobiliar seigneuries can extend over everyone and everybody. They didn't even need that, as we will see now. On the contrary, they were fostering autonomies in their own regard, and or at some point, extending their control, especially in the later Middle Ages, in that dynamic we were talking about before. That we'll see for Racconigi as well, even though the point is Racconigi was further sort of developing shortly after its birth, under the influence of the Marquis of Saluzzo. These minor Piedmontese noblemen, del Carretto, there are different houses aside from Savoy as well. There's Montferrat, of course. They are really interesting, right? There is that sort of old-style feudal flavor to that. But in spite of this, there were people who had remained substantially free and that were augmenting on their own such liberty, in a way. So what was the point, of course, of creating a commune, well, being stronger on the international scene. Because, yes, they're autonomous, they could do this, they are freemen, and they also have serfs on their own and so on. But the end of the 12th century, we've seen it often in different videos, is a moment of tumultuous growth, and often unregulated one. Here we're talking, for example, after the Peace of Constance, that is to say, when the emperor recognizes the Lombard communal liberties, that brings these cities to start properly expanding, or at least like finishing their expansion on different surrounding centers, something that had triggered the same imperial intervention back in the day, and that in fact leaves instead space to this sort of unchecked growth and expansion. This is true in Piedmont as well. So the Racconicians decide that it's time to, stand their ground on a more cohesive fashion. And in particular, the Marquis of Saluzzo appears on the horizon. We do not know too much, unfortunately. It would be interesting to digress on how much we actually know source by source about this incident. But it's like, so by the end of the 12th century, yes, you do know a lot, but you can't quite reconstruct in chronological detail everything that is going on, especially in an area like this, that again is very close to some of the best documented ones, but say the same chronicles are relatively episodic, uncritical to at least extend on such information. Otherwise, they're the most advanced in the world at this point in the region. Nevertheless, we know that, of course, there are clashes, right? There are clashes between Racconigi and the Marquis of Saluzzo. These ones, by the way, are basically upstream of the various rivers that exist in the area, like entering the Alpine, descending from the Alpine Valley together with this nobiliar power. And Racconigi is one of the sort of more valley communities that have to withstand this attack. This is important because Piedmont does not have a major center of power. We've seen that Asti is quite influential. There is the Marquis of Montferrat, that is more powerful entity. Savoy is, just beginning to look at these places in a more sort of interventionistic fashion, and so, and yet the same nobiliar power is somehow limited still, and so everything is in proportion to the places. These communes fight for their independence from these other lords. Consider that the Marquisate here is intended because it was recognized really from an ancient nobility, so it really belonged to the hierarchy of the Holy Roman Empire. I don't think there were particularly, crushing ideological implications in this clash, but it wouldn't be so strange that, say, the Marquises of Saluzzo were sort of not necessarily aligned with imperial power all the time, because, of course, things could change depending on the circumstances. Just yesterday we've seen how even the loyal Habsburgs at some point in 1245 signed it after the Council of Lyon against the emperor with the papacy. Lots of similar issues are going on here. We're not that far away in time and in space, telling the truth. Whereas the communes opt for greater liberty, right, for greater autonomy. The Marquis of Saluzzo, however, clashing with these communes, realizes that he can't really prevail in absolute terms, even though he has the upper hand if you look at it. So there is a deal in the end by which the homines of Racconigi secure a written recognition of their local customs by this lord, right? Essentially, this is very important because there is always clientele relation, where another. The clashes are not just with the Marquis of Saluzzo, that also has different enemies on his own. So the idea is that, of course, this is just a rural commune. It's not such a powerful town that can reach to the skies by itself. The major lords in the area are these pre-alpine, feudal ones that can serve as protectors, even when they are essentially asking for something in exchange. It's a very sort of mobster mentality. The important, though, is recognize this temporary, assertion of power of theirs, because this is not a surrender to a total resignation from their liberal ambition. It's rather, okay, now let's ally with one another, let's recognize one another, let's have it written from this feudal lord in particular that we exist and that we have local customs, that we are an actual entity on the territory. Because these communes, by the way, were doing the same thing with the smaller ones, other inhabitants of the countryside. And it's all like a power dynamic. This is important on the scene, because when you don't have much other authorities out there, especially like there is a vacuum in the imperial one, it is better to receive at least any kind of recognition of safeguard from the more powerful guy around, which also recognizes that they can't simply crush these guys and simply become a tyrant on their shoulders. Alongside, but distinct from the hominis organized into a commune, there exists a class of milites who held seigneurial rights in the area. This is also very interesting, because while the Marquises of Saluzzo are sort of big lords at a provincial level, there is this estate of knights that were technically still like nobility, just of a lower rank, that also have their own seigneuries, and that, of course, tend themselves to aggregate and want to be represented. They are, of course, this is the traditional backbone. I made a video recently on this topic of the local military. Right, these are professional, heavily armored, mounted fighters that can afford their lifestyle, exactly because they exercise the seigneury over somebody else that is working for providing them with these enormous resources to effectively protect them in turn to what is supplied to the knights, and of course they associate themselves with one another. They maintain their rackets. They of course oppose themselves as much as possible to this greater powers. They can associate, disassociate, depending on who they are, what they do. Like many of these peoples would have gone to the Crusades, for example, would have even at some point fought for the Marquis of Saluzzo. They had their own castles, their little castra, let's say, here and there, not controlling too much, but let's say having a minimal protective capacity on the surroundings, like deterrent power, some important range of military action. And of course they have broader relations even with the surrounding cities in the Po Valley and other lords, right? So in 1198, the Marquis of Saluzzo allocates half of the revenues from the communal bannum of Racconigi, with the other half attributed to the same commune, so to the same hominis, to those milites. Now this is very interesting, because as a power-sharing situation, you have the Marquis of Saluzzo recognizing the commune of Racconigi. Right? That is to say, this thing exists, these are actual people, they're recognized again by a feudal authority that is part of the hierarchy within the Holy Roman Empire, in the Italic Kingdom, and yet there are other elements that are not exactly born, say, under the commune themselves. Some of these milites would have lived within the same Saluzzo, themselves. Like there is a process of urbanization that sort of, even in these rural communes, eventually brings to some sort of endemic concentration, fortification, markets, and so on. So that there is a hierarchy there. There is some nascent patriciate of sort. And essentially the Marquis says, okay, there is this commune. The revenues from its bannum, that is to say, basically everything that derives from the exercise of the seigneury that the commune has on essentially its own inhabitants and the surroundings, which is delimited also in a territorial sense, will go, again, one half of it to the same homines that have founded this commune, and another half to the milites that are themselves a sort of commune on their own, a sort of university on their own that is separated from the one of the original commune. This is interesting because first of all, it shows you how normally, like the idea of communes, of universities, of leagues, etc., was just ingrained in also the estate level, right? That knights despise, say, the homines, right? Even if they're freemen, the sense is that the knight is still a more noble individual than even of this freeman that can and will use arms, because this homines, again, let's stress it, as freemen in arms, especially in the Lombard tradition. Here we are in Piedmont, but say Lombardy has a broader cultural reach, like especially at this point in the higher Middle Ages as such, is one of, again, like the Romano-Germanic citizen in arms, right? There's not just rustics that at some point decide to unite in some rural village, right? They are, some active people in different crafts, etc., and they can put up a fight, a struggle. Of course, the knights around are, as you've seen, instead the elite, military-wise. They fight with the most updated fashion, and they dislike the idea, if not of the commune, of the fact that this is run, at least by people who are lower in status compared to their own, right? So what results in this, from this picture, is an idea of, again, mobster power sharing from the side of these knights on the commune, that, again, the Saluzzos, as the top higher nobility here, cannot fully and directly control, because otherwise it would have probably not even recognized the same commune of Racconigi, but that has to share the power of the same, not just with the homines that have established it, but with this rapacious knights, this rapacious milites that live in the surroundings, right? This is completely normal, right? The level of societal organization and political regulation is pretty much as in other places, right? This is actually very similar to what is happening in the rest of the Italian communes, except Racconigi is not conventionally part of what historiographically we call that. I mean, they are communes again, but yes, we found out that communes existed everywhere in Europe, also in places that are not remembered for city-statehood. The main difference here, of course, that this is some sort of rural town, and so it's not part of the previous civitates stemming from Roman times that have this very deep, right, urban centrality in the territory, and have this massive infrastructural basis to coalesce power from. These are sort of more attuned powers. This is the reason why, first of all, the commune is not born until the end of the 12th century. Otherwise, the Italian urban communes are born between the end of the 11th to the beginning of the 12th century. If you're curious, as you know, I have a pretty large playlist about the Italian, but also another about the broader European communes, and this you can find this information all in depth there. The analogy with the communes here is that there is essentially a military estate, the knights, that has like a very robust level of control on the commune as well. They get half of its revenues. And so this is very similar to the consular regime that exists in the Italian communes, whereby the knights basically control the entire system itself. This is slightly different. First of all, I would say because the commune is born properly out of the homines, whereas back in the day, in the larger communes, the commune is born out of probably the military, of the milites, or their will. Secondly, there's probably also some size concern. I mean, this is not a huge center, so many knights in the area live in castles as opposed in the city, and so they can sort of exercise more like a seigneury over this town, as opposed to simply be part of it, even though, as we will see now, with the expansion of the commune in the following centuries, there is some upper hand that at least the commune has. The initial separation between milites and homines will be partially surpassed, so because there is an increased stratification within the same homines, and so it's not much like the generic term that you find in the earlier, say in the high medieval sources. Of course, the other major difference is that here you don't have milites that are part of the commune. They are already a commune on their own that receives half of the revenues deriving from the banal lordship over the commune as a separated one, right? So first of all, there is no such thing in the other communes like the bigger, again, what would become the city-states, like a banal lordship of one guy over coming from the outside that is especially not another city, right? So this shows you why this area is, how this area is also less urbanized, etc. And secondly, there is not this sense of alterity, like of again the knights are something separated from the commune. In the other communes, the knights live there and they constitute the active part, the one that actually starts ruling on, say, these milites of the countryside. So this gives you the dimension of how things differ, right? Now, what happens, however, is that the commune that is recognized, it's an entity, it's really not going anywhere, increases in power predictably during the 13th and the 14th century, becomes a more important center that brings to the gradual centralization of the local communal district, admittedly still under marquisal control. The Saluzzos are still the lords of this commune. This is particularly important. Another major issue, as we were saying before, here is not just there are the milites exercising some power sharing of it, but there is this higher overlord, or is feudal lord over the commune. However, this is what paradoxically happens, that the Saluzzos themselves say allow this commune to develop further in order to regulate the coercive powers and jurisdiction held by the same, what are called now in the later sources, domini, which essentially these are the lords, right? That refers to essentially whichever miles, whichever knight would have had some sort of, preeminent control, even within the aforementioned commune of milites, exercising power of this one of homines. What does it mean? It means that essentially the latter, and mainly the center as such, Racconigi as such, is becoming more resistant from external infiltration, and so these knights that initially simply leave, let's say, these are a commune of homines, I'm a knight, I can do whatever I want, I go there, get into a brawl, destroy the local, crops or whatever, because these are just lesser people, I don't care. Now, these people have organized themselves soundly, of course, thanks to other milites that have been urbanized, have come to live in this town, and also defend it, because they understand there is much to gain from that. I mean, it's a market, it's located on some relevant territory. Piedmont produces a lot of, for example, wine. There are specialized crops, etc. This happens because the Commune and the Saluzzos try to reduce, they have a shared interest in reducing the power of the rural nobility. The Saluzzos want to be the greater masters that control the entire countryside, ideally. And the Commune is something that is, in this case, going to be sort of mostly passive. They don't have the capacity to organize, I don't know, an army expedition against the knights in the countryside. I mean, in part, it would have happened, surely, at some point, that Racconigi organized a punitive expedition against one knight nearby and destroyed his castle, whatever. But there is no force, essentially, capable of threatening the Saluzzos, that also compared to other princes like the ones of Montferrat or Savoy are also pretty marginal, or at least they're secondary in power. So this dynamic, of course, alters the rural lords standing within Racconigi and their relationship with the same associational body of the hominis that is still fundamentally the basis for this Commune. Again, hominis stands for generic freemen, so it can be pretty much everyone. Like, there would have presumably been milites that were part of this Commune of hominis, right? So we don't have all the details, but as we've seen, there were some knights that had been accepted in the town. Just at this point, this local Commune, originally of hominis, is more important than what these guys have been, as it showed here by the regulation. We'll see now more in detail that is operated against. In fact, at least the most preeminent lords have to attempt any stronger grip on the Commune, which is, remember, what the Commune had been founded for. And that's why it had been recognized by and with the help, thus, of the Marquis of Saluzzo, so that nobody else would touch it. That was the other motivation from the Saluzzo side. If you establish this Commune, and you do so by also establishing an exclusive relationship with it, you will not have these other knights in the surroundings interfering with it. And so it's your asset, because it's not a dangerous one. Just you gain more power being allied with it against the other rural noblemen than simply trying to share power with those guys, because these guys are pervasive, as you understand. They're difficult to sort of disentrench from their castles in the various subalpine valleys, whereas the Commune is sort of more exposed. It's also more concentrated, right? If you want to crush these milites, you have to dislodge them one by one. You have to carry out a siege for every single castle. It's very complicated. The Commune instead is more vulnerable, but it's also more compact. And so if you give it some adequate, some critical mass capable of defending the same community, like, it can reward you also against checking those guys, constituting a bulwark against them. Which is especially true during the peak existing of Racconigi, the general communal development, the peak of medieval civilization between the 13th and the 14th century, where you can see the integration at the leadership level occurring gradually on a personal basis. Essentially, the Commune decided which dominus could, at this point instead in the sources called nobilis, right, can join the common people's Commune, rather than, remember, the noble organization, the noble community still exists out there, right? So the term nobilis here is used to refer to, of course, people that also in the countryside have increased their status, because the 13th century says it's the peak of feudalism, so even these guys, each one in their own castles had an ever more affluent lifestyle, so they were more powerful, say they had more organized military retinues, etc. So they're more easily identifiable as nobiles, right? This is, I don't know, we talked recently about the Florentine Commune. You could say that these are the magnates of the situation, right? And in fact, the term dominus, domini, plural, is very indicative of the idea that these guys come there to command, right, with the intention to do so. So in some ways, they are still understood as such, except that the commune, for just a marginal power, that the commune now is able to preserve and keep, of course, the rest for itself, in order to hopefully further increase it at the expense of these external figures, unless you want to enter the commune, which is exactly the point. Like, this happens also in the other Italian communes. Lots of rural milites really urbanize. They go live into the commune because they feel stronger, they feel better protected. This is a concern not just for the homines, but also for the milites, because at some point, like, if you also with your own force, not just the fact that this is an important center, you can have power and influence there, but you can also defend it from some more articulately developed standpoint, politically, militarily, and socially. Well, the better. Like, you will be part now of this more, this less unique dimension, but bear in mind that these, this less unique status, like, that you will acquire by entering there, because in the longer run you tend to also to bond with the others, in some more unitary sense. But this area still retains, of course, a big deal of, let's say, of feudal capacity, like feudal recognition, like nobiliar ancestry and, dynastics, also when they are urbanized to an extent, also because they do not sell their castles in the countryside normally, so they can, of course, this happens in any other community, we've seen it very often. That's also why the nobility here maintains overall in Piedmont a greater relevance. We've seen how also in, say, in much more developed areas, much more urbanized ones, the rural nobility ends up sort of eroding the same commune in the various factional clashes between the same city-states. Then, of course, one will take over normally, but in some failed areas, like when that are hegemonized by other city-states, especially on the fringe of their power, the stretch of their power, you have all these failed communes that are run mostly by the rural. Say, it's erroneous to call them rural nobility, because they are sort of urbanized themselves always, especially in Italy. There is nothing outside of the city, even when it's literally physically outside of it. Everything revolves around that. But we've seen it in that video about the condottieri recently, that, of course, especially in the mid-14th century, etc., the broader public crisis caused by the pandemic, by the general collapse of the system, brings these guys back to not just to power, but to be more protagonistic. I mean, some of these guys are condottieri themselves, and Piedmont has all a specific history that is important to cover at some point in this regard too. There is a document from the Marquis of Saluzzo in 1335 designated the Commune of Racconigi as, this is in the text, quote, Commune nobilium et popularium hominum Racunixii. This is extremely fascinating for a couple of reasons. So you understand that there is a complete organizational symbiosis in contrast to the initial clear dualism. Because there were two communes before. One of the milites / nobiles / domini, and the commune of the homines, of the people, the commoners. Instead, here you have the beautiful definition. Commune, it's a single commune. Nobilium et popularium hominum. So essentially, the commune of the noblemen and of the, say, common people of Racconigi, right? notice, of course, the order here. The nobiles come first, and then you have the people second. And this is obviously true, because the people do not have, again, simply the upper hand. You understand the militares have sort of hegemonized the system from the within. So there is a competition, a regulation, as we've seen, that the homines make against the militares, but at the end of the day, it's because these homines also were run internally by the militares. Otherwise, how could you enforce your own authority? What is fascinating here is that, unfortunately, we can't sort of fully document, because it's such a small reality that we barely have information, but it was small, so quantitatively speaking, is, of course, the continuous violence that had been existing throughout all these centuries. There are so many other different communes and fiefs around, etc., that everybody's clashing. There are regular violences. You can imagine like centers like Racconigi literally having bands of, a handful of knights fighting against one another. But it's not like in the surroundings there aren't larger ones. The Marquis of Saluzzo have, say, I don't know, several tens that they can spend, perhaps even more, men-at-arms. We are in 1335 at this point. There are interesting things happening on different fronts. For example, Asti too had, for example, been contended between the Angevins and the Visconti of Milan. Right, there is Savoy in between. It also has different branches that correspond to dynastic partitions, but so due to this alpine territory, all separated in valleys with different castles and so on. And Asti at some point is crushed. There are clashes internally that are sponsored by the Guelphs and the Ghibellines. Consider that from the other side of the Alp there is Provence that is run by the Angevins, that are the ones together with Naples, right, and the papacy, etc., that often in fact intervene as with these French Occitan forces in the Italian affairs, like they side with the Guelphs. They also launch raids into Ghibelline Lombardy. They do very interesting thing. At this point, if anything, the bigger event in Piedmont during these years is the fact that basically the Angevin system collapses, especially in northern Italy. Like the Neapolitans do not have money to subsidize it further. So basically, with the end of King Robert, he doesn't send money anymore, and the local mercenaries basically cannot be maintained, and the Visconti take over. And Asti is the most important center, so that's sort of the most relevant thing that is going on, also because the Visconti are really like one of the greatest forces in Europe at this point. So it's fascinating because it shows what would be apparently like a continuity of the Milites regime that instead had, well, admittedly, northern Italy had never been ousted, right? We are a bit more habituated, looking especially recently in the series about Florence, of course, the popular commune. You see here the terminology, right? The populares homines. So there is a sort of popolo here that is a political entity within the same commune, and then there are this sort of more magnate style power. But let's say in northern Italy, and especially in these areas that are a bit more feudal, like Piedmont or the Trevisan Mark, you have a much greater power of the greater noblemen, what were called like the great lords of Lombardy in mentality, right? In Milan, there was, for example, like it's the best example of power sharing. There were the noblemen, there was the archbishop, and the people as well, and they sort of never. There is the seigneury, of course, that comes on top of that, the Visconti, in fact, but it's otherwise a somehow balanced system. Piedmont is again a slightly more feudal. Now, in Racconigi, that, as we stressed, is a small locality, there is social and institutional framework developing, albeit belatedly resembling that of the citizen communes in Italy during the 13th century. There is no doubt. It's something that doesn't make it, again, to any major relevance, but it still is there in miniature, in an area where it was appropriate because there weren't many communes of that, say, scale of Lombardy to begin with. And the limited range of interests involved, combined with a tendency towards social leveling due to some degree of economic mobility, could be at some point, but it's all baked into broader political issues, as well as the intervention of the Marquis of Saluzzo, who particularly for fiscal reasons appeared supportive of integrating the nobiles, right, of Racconigi into the common people's commune, prevented tensions between the two factions from escalating into intense clashes. This is also particularly relevant because, again, the Saluzzos are there, they will remain historically. And so behind this knightly integration in the commune, in a mostly peaceful, cooperative way with the people, of course, there is the marquional power, the Marquis, that really says the more people there are in this commune that, remember, is under my signory as Marquis of Saluzzo, the more I can squeeze out of that commune in a sort of also tidier, orderly way. As we said before, it's not just like the knights of the countryside are hopefully, not to be touched because you get into this thorny task of having to dislodge them from their ancestral lands into impervious valleys, etc. They're simpler to rule over if you give them this chase, like this bait in the commune that is expanding in wealth, and can essentially attract more of them there, but remembering them that, of course, if you lived in the commune, you had to pay a certain due to the overlord, that is the Marquis of Saluzzo, that has sort of allowed, has recognized the existence of the commune in exchange for this income, which is a much more efficient way than going, let's say, at random around scattered populations across the valleys. So this is really fascinating. There are, of course, homines of the earlier era that, as we just said, may have become milites, which is really typical of the Italian communes becoming knight by census, right? A very qualifying characteristic considering the wealth of the centers, that in fact passed from the original commune of homines to the one of the milites. But as we've seen by the 14th century, this is now a unique commune altogether. And this is also relevant because both sides at some point will have decided that it's useless to treat each other as two different universities. Let's join together our forces and let's be just one. Let's, of course, maintain the distinction of who is a noble and who is a commoner, but let's be like a unitary polity, which sort of makes a lot of sense. I mean, this is really resembling, in fact, in a broader sense, aside from the scale and especially the timeline, what is happening in the other Italian communes, which is really, really fascinating. The Marquis of Saluzzo intervenes when there are clashes that do exist. Not everything goes smoothly. Again, we can't document this too well, but we do see these nobiles and populares that fight against one another, and literally also within the respective divisions, because of course there would have not been just clashes between the two, but also say, I don't know, some milites that sided with the people, and the others who sided with, and sometimes there were just clashes against each other for petty reasons, right? Not just ones of rivalry, of preeminence. Remember, there are the domini as well, and that these are somehow regulated, because of course there is the stronger guy that wants to rule over the others, regardless of whichever commune he belonged, and of course other people do not want that, so that there is some kind of police that is formed around this as a deterrent. It's, however, mostly the Marquis of Saluzzo that can go with the heavier hand, with the iron fist, and say, okay, like, bringing order brutally and effectively. And it's not easy, by the way, because you have all kind of enemies around that can interfere with this reality. We find often occasions and moments of partial integration within the actual functioning of the local institutional framework from the side of different people that were sort of good-willed and understood, say, the opportunity represented by the commune as such. So the rural commune of Racconigi emerged from the initiative of peasants. If you look at it from the beginning again, whose interests focused on basic survival, had already fostered connections at the Vicinia level. So this is a step back to see at the origin, like how these groups had formed to begin with, like how does a rural commune form. So the term vicinias is considered that in modern Italian, vicino means neighbor, right? And it stems etymologically from the term vicus, which means village, that, as you know, was there is the civitas, which is again also what the bigger communes stem from as the city, for in fact which the term comes. And then in the district, that is also the one of the dioceses. So this is since Roman times, you have all these various villages that are called like vici, vicus singular. And so the sense is that during the early Middle Ages, these repartitions survive. They're called, now vicinia is already Italian vernacular, right? So it's different from Latin, but it basically means the same thing. Like it's a neighborhood. It's some sort of a local community that you live like in, just at a very local level, side to side, same houses, the same demic conglomeration, referring properly to the collective body of inhabitants of the same vicus with roots in a more or less ancient origin. I mean, some of these vici could literally date to very long time ago. Like we don't know when, to some point, because it's not like we have, unfortunately, like the history of every single vicus wouldn't be so important. But some could be really very ancient. Others could have just been formed, because the vicus is not simply like a place trace on the ground. Like it's a neighborhood. In fact, it's a community that has this primitive basic form of organization, even from a military point of view. Remember that the rural communes have their own military capacities, and they typically contribute to, say, I don't know, if the Marquis of Saluzzo here wages like a war against a hostile, like a rival noble house. Well, some guys from Racconigi, say, I don't know, 20 infantrymen with pikes, crossbows, and pavises will go fight against that guy, especially in the 14th century. Admittedly, especially by the 14th century, by the 30s in particular, there is a tendency of these communes to delegate everything to a professional elite of some sort. There's plenty of mercenaries, also from abroad. So again, I just made a video about the condottieri. We discussed that period specifically is very much dominated by foreigners in the service, however, still of the Italian lords. Here there's this mix a bit like with Savoy, the Angevins. There are lots of Provençals, of Frenchmen, but also Germans. Exactly starting from this era, we'll make videos about Piedmont better to really feel what it means here. To look at, however, a general contraction also of the local autonomies. That's why we, in fact, stopped by the 14th century here, because it's not like Racconigi eventually develops further into something particularly more advanced. I mean, if you visit that, it's still like a town, like, typical, like, I don't know, Italian Piedmontese town. There is that rural flavor as well. But it is like a real center right? So it's not like a simple village. It's something that definitely betrays that medieval conglomeration that otherwise was not. I'm not sure, I haven't researched this before the video, but I doubt it was something more straightforwardly originary, dating to ancient times. I mean, I'm sure there was some, it's practically certain it was, of course, settlement continuity, but it wasn't like a city that simply Racconigi developed from in any meaningful way compared to what it would become as a medieval center, right? So there is a sense of neighborhood. This is how we just said it. The local militias also fought normally. The people that lived next to them, family, friends, was just a way to maintain the esprit de corps in a paramilitary force. The inhabitants spontaneously reorganized based on long-standing traditions to regulate civil coexistence as well. There were some forms of justice settlement, for which they would also call this higher noblemen that were provided with higher authority, probably the Saluzzos as a feudal force. But there were peasants, fundamentally, farmers, so they would coordinate agricultural activities, they would exploit common and tenant lands, and allocate water resources. This is why the communes developed, because they sort of manage all this on their own. Yes, there may be, as we just said, a lord that helps them in doing this. And very often you have that cooperation, especially if, like as we've seen here, so many domini are interested in the consolidation of this commune after all. So the surrounding territory is important, and that's why you want to defend it and regulate the local communities and everything. That's how it happened. And that's how it had started from in the midst of the higher Middle Ages, as the Vicini transitioned from simple communal activities to asserting their rights. They sometimes established formal communal organizations, particularly when pressured from seigneurial powers, and therefore necessitating self-defense. Military reasons. Remember that these associations are never, oh my god, they're socio-economical processes destruct. No, these people do that. The only reason to agglutinate in that way is being a politically and militarily active community. So all these guys are, again, also dangerous. Again, don't think that peasants in the high Middle Ages are passive serfs of some sort and to just sit there and do nothing. These people are angry. They're actually evil, right? The most brutal and violent element of society in that sense. It's easy to manipulate in that way. Too further is the fourth estate, is the lesser people, and this is exactly what these people do. And the same knights are scared. I mean, you do have, even in peaks of feudal times, like, I don't know, you don't want to be a single knight out there into these lands if these people are pissed at you. All right, they will ambush you and will take you down, and of course you will try to fight your way through. You will chop through them. At some point you could even make it out, but these are dangerous places to be in to begin with. You're not invincible because you're a knight at all. And of course the self-defense against seigneurial forces was organized to ensure the sustainability of the advancements they had gradually achieved. All this was to survive, not for this commune to disappear. It had been established, remember, to survive to begin with, so it was all they had in a way. The rural commune stands as the highest expression of this phenomenon. However, it should not be assumed that communes always arise within a seigneurial framework, right? This is also the point that we've seen with Racconigi and the Saluzzos, that this was not the case. But aside from being really a matter of life or death in some terms, because at least if you were part of a bigger city, the city, yes, could lose power, but you could still have the commune, right? Subordinated to to somebody else. It's like Asti that we've seen ends up under the Visconti, and that's basically it. But it still remains the commune of Asti. It has to pay money to the Visconti for them to maintain enough mercenary forces in their armies and protecting in the entire area Asti as well. But Asti remains Asti. Nobody dismantles that, right? The modern Italian communes are actually just the municipal survival of that from medieval times, like in other parts of Europe. Instead, these rural communes are potentially to be obliterated. I mean, sometimes you can literally wipe them out. And you know how often it happened? Because it was some of these guys who did that on the other rural communes all the time. That's so vicious, right? But there is also an independence. It's not all under the feudal lords as either. Like in this case, initiatives can also originate from, for example, allodial landholders who from Vicinie somehow independent of the pressures generated by the development of large landed estates decide to agglutinate and coalesce, and yeah, they could see it coming, like it, not like again feudal lords or other magnates, other noblemen weren't around trying to exploit the opportunity. Again, these wars are not isolated, even in the tiniest alpine valleys. However, there are situations in which you would want to associate on your own preemptively. You're not really pressured by anybody. You don't really have anybody's blessing or consensus. We've seen what happened with the same Racconigi. They actually became a commune before the Saluzzos recognized them. So that, it's pretty obvious. You're not waiting just for that green light. You do it by yourself for the same reasons that can always occur. To defend yourself, to avoid somebody, to be caught unprepared by some more rapacious power. And this happens also in relatively small areas that, in fact, maybe even if they could resist for very long, somewhat isolated, were not spared eventually by, given their tiny size, by the affirmation of somebody else's lordship. At that point, they would have not even fought, right? They helped these lords to just find like a tidy district, a rural village to or town proper to be administered, right? To be like to provide with basic things, again, as we've seen, like police, farming, general cooperation, right? And so things would simply start from there. You don't really need to destroy anyone until they start doing something against you or against your interests, or etc. And so again, all kind of destruction did occur in these contexts, but it's not like they were starting from this the presumption of destroying everything they found outside there. Again, there are incredibly brutal clashes, but they're still aimed at gaining something out of it, not simply destroying things. And in fact, the development of the same communes shows it to you, that the same inhabitants of Racconigi first got war with the Saluzzos, which is also pretty brave to do, but at the end of the day, they probably realize they can't make it. And so the Saluzzos can't simply subjugate them either, right? Fully at least. And so the reaction, like, okay, let's make a deal, and let's make this work at some other level that can be used, like in this case, to counter the rural nobility, which makes a lot of sense. Because the rural nobility is more violent. Again, they are like mobsters. They have that kind of chivalric lifestyle. It is typically violent. They make tournaments. They destroy the peasants' crops. They don't really have, especially in this era, much of a broader civility. in a startled sense. So they really believe that they are the masters of the land. And it's also fascinating if you look at these pictures inserted here, the various landscapes. It's just think about the riding across this territory and enjoying like local, Italian wine from, stolen from the peasants who were working that. But it's not too sustainable on the longer run either. So many of these guys decide to enter the communes themselves. And so there are all other factors. For example, the aforementioned geographic conditions, such as the location of these communities along crucial communication routes. This was often the case. Bridges, the end of valleys, or whatever, like particularly fertile areas. It really depends. Most of it is political. Again, geopolitics does not exist, but geography does play an important role as well. And so it's just the land's configuration itself. It can be a hilltop, whatever. Especially in this more mountainous areas, of course, that would be very much exploited practically. And so it's interesting, again, I said it at the beginning of the video, that we were talking about Switzerland, because we'll definitely have to see how, just yesterday we got a glimpse of how complicated the creation of the Confederacy was, because as if it had started exactly from all these various rural communes that, as we've seen, had been conferred like rights of imperial immediacy by the German rulers, and then eventually they exploit their autonomization, the weaker feudal ties, the general credit. There are lots of interesting reasons behind that, and you can argue that there is, of course, a lot in common between the valley communes in Italy, as well as certain locations in Switzerland where specific so-called freedoms, in that case, have emerged. The Italians use the term libertas. In German it's Freiheit, so it's different. There are two different etymologies. They mean different things, but in fact they often have also different outcomes. Right? Germany feels more the idea of freedom because it's more connected to that imperial mandate, but less people have it, and so that's why it's so, at least, sought after as essentially a charter that the emperor said, like, nobody can touch you if I say that they can't, even though everybody could, including the same emperors, as we've seen with the Habsburgs yesterday. But the in the Italian communes, there's the etymology of liberty that stems from the idea of still some degree of dependence on who is superior to you by divine will, which actually corresponds to much greater actual liberty. These are the more, say, autonomous, like egalitarian, republican sort of oriented systems in the world at the time. And it's meaningful that they have this more even sophisticated way of conceiving their own, not freedom, but liberty, which are two different etymologies, Germanic and Latin alike, but that also compenetrate each other if you look at the various outcomes. Like in this case, the small Racconigi does not go anywhere. It's absorbed eventually by the Savoy power, whereas, say, the Swiss communes managed this in there to become Switzerland, literally out of nothing, right? So it's also quite powerful, quite an achievement there, and also as a contrast, right? So again, we could talk a lot about this stuff. As you understand, what I care about when I talk this histories is getting how things actually work. Like, it's not just reading a bunch of stuff and saying, well, okay, let's hope they understand what I mean, or this is my language because you studied this in history. No, I try to give you the real, like, how did it work? Like, what would bring this stuff to be, to be viable, right? Why would they do this? Like, and so I always pose myself the question because, frankly, when you go to university, you may study from very different good sources, etc., but it's not like they actually explain you how or why that system worked that way, right? It took me like well after university or till towards the end of it to really start understanding what, for example, why monasticism existed. And not just in a, say, in a minute, actually, the ideal sense was somehow clear. At a sort of basic ABC level, you can understand why monasticism existed, but why did monasteries exist? Let's say, why were they so important in different parts of the world, but also why were these differences? And of course, you have to understand there is always some deeper reason, some concrete mechanism that you have to explain. Just doesn't happen by itself. The same goes for the communes that, as you know from Schwerpunkt, I try to quite campaign for, because I believe they are possibly the single most overlooked topic in pop culture about medieval history. And people do not really get even what we're talking about. So if you explain concretely what the actual deal, like the ratio strengths of power, like there is this almost Petersonian sense that it's not about power, because if you say it's all about power struggle, you're making the point of the Marquis. No, guys, that's not the point. It's the exact opposite. Marxists want to destroy power, all right? They want to destroy humanity, and so they can't accept that somebody has power. We are traditionalists, and of course power is everything, because power means divine grace. It means you have done the right thing in order to get it. And so it's always about power, and it's always about reciprocal influence. And I think studying the Middle Ages, you've seen these deep intersections here between, the Saluzzos, the Racconigi, the various nobility of the countryside. It's never banal. It's never like, oh, okay, so it's just a class struggle, the rich, the poor. No, that's BS, right? And that's how they have say. That's all what they have told you. That's why they're hiding this history from you, because they want to make you think it is just some other story about the peasants exploited. It's completely the opposite of that, and it just it just makes you more intelligent, right? There is no way around that. It's not the claim I'm intelligent because I know this, but it definitely makes you more intelligent to really understand this power sharing dynamic, its complexity, and so you understand even how a small land like Racconigis can really give you so much, can make you really understand so much about the world. I think it's very, very, very relevant. Right? I think it's one of the most interesting things that you can study at the end of the day. Right? There's always this level of surprise, this level of I didn't know, and I wish I had known. Somebody had told me, and that's how and why I make videos for to begin with. And it does seem to work. It does seem to be what was really needed, and we will at some point dip in this, because I'm making this video was from the cycle, by the way, and just this topic comes every once in a while. I don't remember which was the last rural commune we discussed. I think it was not even a rural commune, it was Amiens, in the relation with Philip VI. That was an interesting one, for example. It's a similar dynamic. There's the church in between. It's more fascinating even. I think we made at the very beginning of Schwerpunkt the case of Sahagún in Spain. But it's plenty of this. Like, I'm going to make so much about the European communes until you will be saturated. I already know that you look at these videos and say, oh, I don't care because it's not about the topic, it's boring. But, you don't know what you lose if you, in quite concrete terms. Now, anyway, for today, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.